Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. If you like my work, if you like the podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can check me out there at Brandon Tumblin. There you get early access to all the episodes. You get a special personalized gift from myself, and I also offer my coaching services there. Also, check me out on Telegram, where I am building a community there to discuss the topics of the episode, so you can get engaged there into the community, the Strong Stoic community. And also, check me out on Medium, where all my blog posts are. Now, let me introduce my guest. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Todd Leader. Todd is a social worker and community psychologist. He spent well over 20 years in his career leading service development and transformation up here in Canada, particularly in the areas of mental health, addictions, health promotions, and primary health care. So in this episode, we talk about a lot of different things, but mostly we talk about how to care for people, how to address mental health with a holistic approach, not a cookie cutter approach, and also how to build and maintain relationships and much, much more. So I had a lot of fun talking to this guy, so please welcome Todd Leader. So Todd.
That's good.
Welcome. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to talk to you.
That's good to be here.
Yeah, so you've done a lot of work on the East Coast and in a lot of different areas, but mostly client-centered care. I guess just to break the ice, I'd be interested to know what's one of your proudest accomplishments that you've achieved.
Well, I guess it would be the thing that actually led me to write my book originally, which was that I had the privilege of leading a team in part of Nova Scotia, a mental health and addiction program, in which we managed to actually transform the way the system worked and make it client-centered, which included reducing the wait times in a very significant way. For adults, they dropped from 8 months to 1 month. And for adolescents, they dropped from 5 months to 1 to 7 days. And we maintained that for 2 or 3 years. So it wasn't just a blip. So lots of organizations, they'll put on a blitz, like an intake blitz for a while,
right?
Just to get rid of the wait list. And so then they can claim they don't have one. And that's not what we did. We actually changed the way the system worked so that people were getting in and getting care, and but in a way that was sustainable.
Yeah, that's a huge thing for anyone. So I got a lot of American listeners, so maybe they don't understand, but in Canada we have a socialized, a public health care system. And so the waiting times, particularly in the East Coast, they have been like notoriously long, right? You're trying to get help. I remember like as a kid, you break something, it's like, oh damn, I'm gonna be waiting for a while.
For sure. And the addiction and mental health systems are across the country actually are really, really struggling. And have been for several years, really struggling with accessibility. So people are waiting for months if they get care at all. And the nature of addiction and mental health issues is that there is a now that's required. There is an urgency to it because any illness in that area, it's similar to many what we consider kind of traditional medical illnesses in that it's progressive. And so that, and I don't mean it's ahead of its time. I mean, if untreated, if unmanaged, it progresses. It gets worse over time. So someone starts to develop some symptoms of depression or anxiety or something like that. If they don't do anything about it, if nobody helps them to learn how to manage it, if there's no counseling or skill building or medication or whatever is needed for that individual, if nothing happens, those symptoms will get worse, and they ultimately will end up, many of them, at an emergency department because there's no other place to go, and their illness has progressed to the point of real crisis and life-threatening crisis. When if the system worked well, intervention could have been there to prevent them from ever progressing to that state, and they could be managing their life and managing that condition the same as I have a son who has diabetes. Well, he manages it. That's his life, and he has no choice but to manage that. And that's the way it should be with many mental illnesses. And, people learning to manage it early so that it's mild.
Yeah, and on the topic of mental health, it's we've been in a pandemic for 2 years now, and that certainly hasn't helped everything. And addiction, I mean, people struggle with addiction in all sorts of ways. I think one of the most modern manifestations of that is the cell phone. People are so addicted to social media. I've made a personal effort to detach myself from that this year. So, don't check the phone first thing in the morning, and give it some time, and use that do not disturb feature. Have you I don't know if you're in that recently, but have you noticed any increases or anything different in terms of the COVID pandemic?
Well, I know that the people who are doing the research on it have absolutely seen the data showing that we have increases in demand for mental health supports because of COVID, and a lot of that is young people, children and adolescents, because the children are really kind of growing up in a culture where they have to be scared of other people.
Yeah.
They have to be scared to breathe normally without having it covered with a mask. They have to be, and they're hearing messages that if they don't take all of those, what really are extreme precautions, compared to the pre-COVID world.
Yeah.
If they don't do those things, they might die. And that's kind of the message. And so most of us didn't grow up with that. We could do whatever we wanted whenever we wanted, and we could go outside and eat dirt if we wanted, and
meat mud pies.
Yeah, absolutely. Breathe on each other, spit on each other. We could do what we wanted as kids, and so the people who have been doing the studies, following the trends, they're all consistently saying that there's increased demand. And that's a problem because our systems were already falling behind.
Right.
They were already unable to keep up with the demand, and I would argue it's significantly because of the way they're designed.
Yeah.
It's not just an issue of money. Most people would say, I hear it all the time, we need more money in the system because we don't have enough capacity. And while that may have some truth in it, absolutely, the amount that we need in terms of increasing funding is really unknown because we don't have our systems designed right to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
If we did, so the work that we did in the program I just described a minute ago, where we reduced the wait times, we did that without new money.
Yeah, it's just more efficient.
Just redesigning the system to make it efficient for the clients more so than efficient for the system.
Yeah.
And that ended up creating, secondarily, efficiency for the system.
Right.
And so I think if we get to the point where we redesign systems to truly be about the clients and their efficiency, then we'll be able to tell how much more money we need.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we'll be operating at a point where we should be. And
right.
But we're certainly not there. Very few places across the country are even near that point.
Well, let's get into the client care then. So I mentioned to you before we started, I read a bit of Carl Rogers after we spoke, and he's obviously well known for his focus in client care, and he felt like, and actually maybe we can get into what that relationship actually is, but broadly speaking, he felt that you had to form a relationship with someone to allow them to become their better self, something like that, right? And so, obviously as a care worker, and my mother did a bit of care working as well, or care work as well, and it can be very challenging to do that, to have a relationship with all of your clients in a way, because it can be emotionally draining and emotionally challenging. But I guess before we get into the complications of it, what would that ideal client-patient relationship actually look like?
The most important part, I would argue, is, and this would be consistent with Rogers' work to begin with, is recognizing that, I don't know, if, that the therapist of whatever profession, that the therapist doesn't know more about the client than the client knows. So, and that was one of the key things that made Carl Rogers kind of step out and buck the previous sort of paradigms. He believed that people actually know a fair bit about themselves, and that we should probably listen, and not automatically take the expert kind of role.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not to say that psychologists and social workers and et cetera don't have expertise, because obviously they do, absolutely, and they have specialized skills. Those skills are primarily skills at guiding conversation and guiding thoughts.
Yeah.
The question is, do they spend their time guiding those thoughts and those conversations toward what they believe is best for the client, or helping to guide the client towards solutions that they generate kind of themselves,
right,
in a genuine and authentic kind of way in the conversation. And somewhere in between there is where things are right, I think. But we still have lots of people, lots of professionals and systems that really approach the work as the expert. And I did Friday, I did a couple of keynote talks for the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre, and because they had an all-day conference, and we talked about this concept, of kind of old school thinking in some professions really is very much that expert way of viewing the relationship. And that power differential, it disempowers clients,
right?
Which is the opposite of what we need, and it can make people feel helpless. That they need the expert in order to figure out what's wrong and what the next steps are.
Right.
And many people really just need, while some do need that, because they need something like specialized medication or whatever, but many of them just need to be guided toward a different way of thinking about themselves, and which is more respectful. But there is there's a transition kind of happening in these professions toward more of this client-centered thinking, where I'm not the expert. I have expertise, yes, on mental illness, for instance, or an addiction, but you have expertise on you and your life and all the psychosocial conditions that you live with, all the environmental conditions that you live with. Because we also have this traditional model that still dominates and really shouldn't, but the dominant model in the field is the medical model, and I'm not saying that doctors and psychiatrists shouldn't dominate. That's not my point. It's not about the people. It's about the model itself. A medical model, it looks for dysfunction, it looks for pathology, and then it takes sort of a checklist approach to diagnosing it.
Yeah, right.
And it doesn't account for all the other stuff in your life.
Yeah.
If you're living in poverty, your mental health stuff that we're talking about is directly connected to that.
Yeah, for sure.
If you've been living as the victim of racism or other types of discrimination and prejudice in your life because of your sexual orientation, your ethnicity, then that is a mental health issue.
Yeah.
And a medical model doesn't take account of that, whereas a biopsychosocial model, which is a broader perspective on you and your life, it actually allows your mental health to be considered in a more comprehensive context, and so it's more client centered.
Yeah,
in that way.
There certainly is, obviously there's a neuroscientific description or condition for things like depression, but I really agree with this because if you have a poor sleep schedule, which regulates your hormones, if you don't have any meaningful work, if you don't have any close friends or anyone that you can really talk to, if you don't get maybe a little bit of exercise in, you're not even giving yourself a chance to be mentally healthy. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned poverty as well. So you have all these environmental externals as well, which really contribute to that. But if you were to look at, say, something like depression and only look at the brain and what's happening there, say, well, this isn't functioning properly because of this or whatever, but you're not even looking at the fact that this person is has no meaningful work and has no meaning in their life, period. Like, how can you even give yourself a fighting chance to not be depressed? Like, of course you're going to be depressed if you have nothing meaningful in your life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see this all the time. I see it in my own family. I see it among friends. People's mental state, it moves like a roller coaster, depending on those things, those
Right.
conditions in life. So when somebody is out of work, it doesn't take long for you to see a difference in them in terms of their overall level of optimism, their ability to manage life, psychologically. So we see those things all the time, and also, as I said, racialized populations. The types of mental health struggles that they will often have are really very often directly the result of the way they're treated, and which makes sense. I mean, if you are stigmatized and oppressed, and if you're experiencing any of that discrimination, oppression, stigma, you can't feel good about yourself. You can't feel safe in your society. You can't feel welcomed or connected in your society if that's the society that you live in. And so we have to take those things into account, or we can't claim to be taking a client-centered approach.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
We're taking an approach that's more centered in our own biases, our own assumptions, our own, and those biases and assumptions become the characteristics of the system.
Right.
The system of care takes on those biases and assumptions, which are typically the biases of the dominant culture, which is going to be Eurocentric, and so we have to look beyond that kind of simplistic, you have 2 of these 4 symptoms, and one of these 3, and 6 of these 10, and so therefore this is what you have. And well, it's bigger than that.
For sure. Yeah, it's good to know that, because if you've lost your job recently and you're feeling depressed, well, of course you're going to feel depressed. You can look at it from that perspective as well. It's not that, I hate to use the word it's normal, but in some sense it is. Like, if you've recently gotten out of a romantic relationship, you're not going to feel happy immediately after that. You're not going to feel great. You're probably going to feel upset. You're probably going to feel a bit depressed. And acknowledging and connecting those 2 events, it's a way to sort of take a step back. I mean, like, I know personally, if something happens in my life that throws me off, I don't feel good, but I can recognize, okay, I'm feeling like crap right now, but it's because of this. Yes. And so what do I have to do to address that? Or do I just have to wait and give it a bit of time? Yeah. But that way I'm not like despairing, like, oh my God, my life's falling apart. It's like, no, your life's not falling apart. You made a mistake here and now you feel bad about it, or whatever it is that's creating that mental state. And then recognizing that it's, time is going to mend that. And then maybe you can address whatever that issue is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in many people's lives, those one-time events here and there that happen, those kind of short-term kinds of things, that there's going to be an end to it. That you're able to manage your way through that phase. We experience that when we lose somebody in life. So someone dies. My father died a couple of years ago. So as when people die in our lives, that causes that sort of grief-related sadness and other symptoms, but that is as normal an event as you'll ever find. And people do learn to move past that. They do learn to adjust to or adapt to that new version of their life without that person in it. And that takes time. But some of it's funny. One of the things that was a criticism of the most recent version of DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's like the Bible of diagnosing mental illness. The most recent version of it, one of the changes that came out is grief-induced depression. Well, there's been criticism of DSM over the past couple of editions of it, criticism of it being too unduly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry, who have had direct input into the creation of the criteria. Well, if I'm the pharmaceutical industry, and as an industry, we know that it has a history of corruption. It's been taken to court so many times and paid out settlements for misleading people and manipulating data. So, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. That's public record. That's fact, right? And so if I'm the pharmaceutical industry and I get some input into the diagnostic criteria, well, what do I want to do? I want to lower the bar for a diagnosis. Because the lower that bar is, the more people get prescriptions for antidepressants. So so we lower the bar and we say, well, now when you're experiencing grief because of the loss of somebody in your life, you could be diagnosed as having depression and therefore get a prescription. Right. And so I make more money. So there are those aspects of this system that have pathologized some normal experiences. And I'm not saying that people experiencing grief don't need help or support of some sort, and some might need medication. And I'm not discarding all of that. I'm saying that we shouldn't be putting everyone in that same bucket. Yeah, exactly. And we should be taking more of an individual approach and recognizing normal emotional experience. And support people in dealing with those normal emotional experiences.
And a huge part of that, talking about grief in particular, is being authentic to yourself and how you are experiencing that grief. Meaning don't suppress grief. If you need to cry, if you need to properly deal with that, deal with it. And it's only after you've done that you can effectively move on afterwards in life. Like if you suppress things, eventually it's going to build up. And so the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius is a very famous Roman emperor. He's a famous Stoic, and so he's like the most powerful man in the world, and he's known to have openly, publicly cried in public funerals for his friends. And people think Stoics they don't show emotions, but part of it is, okay, if I'm being authentic, I am feeling grief. I'm not going to tell myself I'm not feeling grief. I'm going to feel grief authentically, and in doing so, you allow yourself to to feel that for one, but then more importantly, to move on afterwards. And that, I think that's centered around Carl Rogers' idea as well of being authentic in your relationships with people and allowing that stuff to occur.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's it's a fine line here, right, between this I don't know, allowing normal things to still be normal, but also recognizing that people sometimes need help with normal. Yeah. They're not mutually exclusive. You can have both. You can have normal emotional struggles and still recognize that we should be helping people with those. Yeah. Without pathologizing it, without abnormalizing it. I know that's not really a word, but I like it anyway.
Yeah, abnormalizing. I like it. Yeah. I'll add it to my vocabulary.
Yeah, and so but I think our job in supporting people who have these kinds of struggles, addiction or mental health related struggles, our job as a society, as individuals in our relationships, and certainly in the professional relationships, our job is to support them in ways that are individualized to their situation. Yeah. Not cookie cutter, not assuming that, okay, well, so you lost somebody to death, somebody died in your family, and so that's normal, so get over it. Yeah, it's not that, because that's cookie cutter, but it's also not well, you're experiencing some depressive kinds of symptoms, so let's pathologize that, let's put a label on it, and let's prescribe, and let's do intensive therapy. And it's sort of cookie cutter, and there's I say in my book actually that there's no such thing as one size fits all, not even in t-shirts. Right. That just doesn't exist. It's a false concept. Right? Yeah. And so when it comes to dealing with people, supporting people, it's just impossible to ever truly reach a point of a one size fits all. We have to individualize every aspect of how we support people. That's why what I wrote about was about the administrative components of our mental health system. Because we haven't given that a lot of thought. We get the concept of individual counseling being, individualized in a sense, but we don't get the concept of the hoops we make people jump through, the forms and the steps and the waiting times and the structures and the people seeing multiple practitioners for different parts of their struggle instead of one to deal comprehensively with the whole person. And there's just so much of that we don't get because we're so hung up on trying to create system efficiency that we take a one-size-fits-all approach. And it just can't work. It will never meet the needs of our society when we do that. And but you mentioned the relationship piece. The relationship piece is really the easiest for people to comprehend. The idea that the way you handle that relationship, the way you nurture the relationship, and the way you communicate in it, the listening and the speaking, that I think most of us, I guess, maybe somewhat naturally individualize that. Like if you think about the way you speak to and listen to different people in your life, those are different types of conversations.
Right.
We just don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
But in fact, we do approach different people and different relationships very differently. And so there's an intuition that takes us to that, what I would refer to as client-centeredness or person-centeredness. There's an intuition there in some of our personal relationships.
Yes, right.
That we do that. I mean, I don't speak the same to my wife or listen the same to my wife as I do to somebody at work.
Yeah.
They're just completely different things going on in my head during those conversations. I'm interpreting it differently. I'm interpreting it in the context of what I know about the person.
Right.
And so, I guess the question is, can we take that individualization and adapt our systems and our services and more aspects of our society, to that approach?
Well, and it's difficult too as a therapist, because you need to be engaged in that particular relationship, and every relationship affects you, right? Whether you like it or not. So if you have clients, you have to allow yourself in some sense to be affected by each of those in order for you to effectively change them. But so I want to talk about the authenticity component of that. I was thinking about this because this is interesting. It's almost like a catch-22. So let's say you and I are speaking, and for me to be my best self, you need to be authentic. But that's sort of a catch-22 because one of us has to start being authentic in order for the other person to recognize the best in themselves, and then we can sort of go back and forth like that. And so I was thinking about this because we sort of do this in our personal relationships all the time. Like if you meet someone new, normally you have a couple masks on, you're very basic formalities and so on. But then one of you might say like, I don't know, I like Pokemon or something like that, something nerdy. And then the other one says, oh, I like Pokemon too. And so over time through a personal relationship, you slowly let out a little bit of truth about yourself. Then the other person does as well. And you sort of over time, you creep towards being authentic in that relationship.
Yes.
Now, what I was thinking, and I'd like your take on this, a good therapist is trained to be authentic. And so they provide sort of a shortcut to that relationship. So when you go to a therapist, again, one that's client-centered, they are being authentic and they have no reserves about that. And that allows you to be authentic in a bit more of a bit more quickly, I suppose.
Yes, there's another catch in that.
Okay.
So therapists are trained. They're trained to, I guess anybody trained in a client-centered type of paradigm, they're trained to be authentic to a point. They're trained to be authentic generally as a person, but they're also trained to maintain boundaries with regard to personal disclosures.
Right. Yeah.
So the example you gave a minute ago about the way we work as individuals in our relationships generally, both people disclose things about their own life and interests and vulnerabilities and whatever, as you said, to gradually creep toward being closer and closer in the relationship. In a therapeutic relationship, there is some level of need, and I guess people interpret that level differently. Different therapists do, but there's some level of need to be cautious in not turning it into a fully personal relationship, which means you have to be careful about the amount and the type of disclosure, of self-disclosure that happens.
On the therapist's side.
On the therapist's side.
Yeah.
You want full disclosure from the client.
Right.
But the self-disclosure from the therapist needs to be somewhat limited, and partly because the conversation can end up being about the therapist. So you start talking about your problems, and I respond with, yeah, you know what, I've been there. Let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
And so I spend the next 5 minutes telling you about some horrific thing in my life that's similar to yours.
Right.
Well, I haven't just helped you. I've actually just turned the attention to my needs, my need to share, and so there's a really fine line there in therapy that people need to maintain. But I know there are people out there who are in therapist kinds of roles who take that way too literally, and therefore do not show the client any authenticity, because you can still be authentic, you can still be genuine, you can still show even vulnerability, you can still show all of that stuff without actually talking about yourself.
Yeah.
Without actually sharing a lot of detail about yourself. A little bit here and there, so you throw it, somebody talks about losing someone in their life, you can say, yeah, I lost my father as well. So little tidbits, there's nothing wrong with that. Because that's just part of keeping the conversation going and providing, examples through which, I'm showing that some of what you're going through I can relate to. I'm not a robot,
So so let's try and take that model again and apply it to personal life. So you would say that, because in personal relationships, it's very therapeutic as well. Like, personal relationships can have a huge therapeutic component to it if it's a good relationship. So you would say that, as opposed to both of you being therapists at the same time, in some ways you maybe take turns being listener versus speaker versus...
I like that, actually. That's interesting. And I think in good mutually supportive personal relationships, that is the way it plays out most likely, and most of the time, and I think that's a very effective way for it to play out.
Right.
So we tend, my wife and we've been married 33 or 34 years, and that is the nature of our relationship. So we do go back and forth. One day I'm her rock, the next day she's my rock.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of it in terms of whose job is it to be the listener at the moment versus the speaker in a sense.
Yeah, well that's
interesting.
Well, that's why relationships, I guess, pose one of the reasons why they're so tough, because how do you decide, like, okay, so let's say you go home to your wife and you have an issue, maybe she has an issue, so you both have issues, and now it's like, okay, well, whose issue is bigger? And it takes one of you to genuinely say, I'm going to put my issue on hold for the moment so that I can be here for the one I love and work through their issues first.
Yes.
And that's hard to do because you have that issue in your head. So, and it's hard to separate that. So how do you, like, if let's say that scenario, if you both come home with issues, how do you negotiate who gets to do the listen, or does it just happen naturally? You get to know each other more over time?
Yeah, I think over long periods of time, that stuff just happens naturally. Or perhaps in some relationships there is I don't know, a natural prioritization of one's needs being more important or something. You might see that happen, but certainly in our case, it is that we'll either kind of take turns, for the evening, or one of us will just not really talk about whatever went on that day, because the other one seems to need the support or the conversation or the venting more. And so I think it is sometimes just one of us will just not share, and maybe the next day we'll end up talking about that. But it's interesting that you note that it is hard, and the implication of that is that if you're in a therapist role, if you're working in a system that's designed to put the other person first,
right,
the client, it is your job to put your personal stuff, your baggage, leave it in the closet.
And maybe that's where the line is drawn for the therapist. This isn't a therapy session for me, so I be authentic. Right. But at the end of the day, this therapy session is for the client.
Right. And so you kind of have to leave part of yourself outside the room. And in terms of whatever went on at home that day or that night, or whatever's going on, you might be facing, you might be facing possible job loss. You might have gotten in trouble at work. You might have gotten a flat tire on the way to work today. Well, all of that stuff, you've got to be able to kind of just leave it outside the door. And genuinely put the other person first. Genuinely recognize that, I exist here in this time and space. I exist here and get paid to exist here,
right,
for someone else's good. And there is this necessary, I think more necessary than anything else, there is a necessary level of selflessness that has to come into play for anybody doing this type of work. And I've seen some people over the years. I've had staff, the odd person who here and there who absolutely they were not there, like in terms of their skill and their I'm going to say even their maturity of understanding the nature of the work. And so I would see those individuals who are the exception, just to be clear, they're the exception, but I would see those individuals saying and doing things that really were more concerned about their own issues than about the clients. And I remember when we were doing this transformation of the system, one of the things we were doing was starting to break the mold of the 9 to 5 service, the Monday to Friday 9 to 5, service for addiction mental health therapy, outpatient appointments. Well, first of all, not everybody can make it during there, but second of all, it's actually discriminatory because of the fact that the higher your level of employment and benefits, and the more likely you are to be able to access that service, because you have paid sick time to be able to go to appointments. You have the flexibility to say, oh, I'll work this evening instead. Right. Whereas people in lower paying, lower benefits, lower authority kinds of jobs, they can't. So they might have to actually lose an entire day's pay just to go for a 1-hour appointment. And so there's real serious discrimination in that 9 to 5 history that we have. But I remember introducing evening hours and hearing from some of the therapists, again, just a few, who just they didn't want it. They didn't want to do it, and you could hear that in every unsubstantiated rationalization that came out of their mouths. You could hear that this was all about trying to not have to do that. And so I remember in one conversation, one therapist said, this was in a meeting, said, this evening hour thing isn't going to work, right? And I said, what do you mean? Well, nobody's going to come. And he said, I've been here for 10 years and nobody's ever asked me for an evening appointment. And my response was, well, okay, everybody in the room here, have any of you ever gone to Walmart and asked for a Toyota Corolla? And they all said, what? No. I said, why not? Because they don't sell them. Right. Why would anybody ask you for an evening appointment then?
Yeah.
We don't sell them.
Exactly.
And so the logic was flawed, but people, certain individuals were reaching at things to really serve their own interests instead of being able to step back and say, yeah, it's maybe it's inconvenient because now you might have to work an evening every week for a couple hours, and there's maybe all kinds of personal reasons why that's not good.
Yeah.
But it's not about us.
Right.
It's not about you. We exist here for the sake of the clients. And so the system needs to change so that it accommodates the client's needs, even at the inconvenience of the staff and the management. It made for a lot more complicated management. It takes a lot more time to manage that, a broader schedule. And so it was a real pain in the butt for lots of people.
Yeah, but, for sure.
Anyway, but it really wasn't supposed to be about us. We were paid to be inconvenienced for other people.
Yeah.
And so our job was, well, I believe, our job and the people in the system, whether they're frontline care or administration or leadership, the job is, I don't know, I guess it is Stoicism. I mean, the job is to tolerate whatever the conditions are that you're supposed to tolerate for the sake of someone else's benefit.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
I'm so happy you actually understand Stoicism. Like that is actually what it is.
Yeah.
It's doing the right thing. It's doing what's best for the world, not what's necessarily best for you as an individual. Sometimes those two align, sometimes they don't. But and you can certainly design systems in a way that makes them more aligned than not. You can, over time, if you create a better world, it is such a world where the thing that is best for you is the thing that's best for your family and the world and the community and so on. But it's not always going to be the case. And right. That's good. I like that.
But there is this necessary level of selflessness.
For sure.
And I say that, with some trepidation a little bit, because saying that can sound like, I don't know, I'm claiming that I or other people in the field need to be, take on this martyr type of complex and get attention for being, so selfless, goody kind of.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying that is the nature of the work that we chose. And so if you make a choice to do a certain job, you need to do it in the way that the job is supposed to be done. And in this case, that's an aspect of the work. If I'm working as an electrician, there are standards, there are expectations, there are things that I am expected to do, even though some of them I might think are a pain in the ass.
Yeah, for sure.
I might be up on a third floor of a new construction running wiring, and I don't want to wear a harness because I feel safe. Well, sorry.
Yeah.
You have to. So just tolerate that, because nobody around you wants to watch you die and suffer the consequences of that.
Yeah.
The company doesn't want the liability and perhaps job loss in leadership because of allowing that to happen. And there are impacts, and so
it's not just about you.
Right. So tolerate those things, because that's what's expected for all kinds of reasons that are not about you.
Right.
Besides being about you, it also is about you, of course, in that example, but.
Well, let's talk about the other extreme. So people who are completely detached. But what about people who get okay, so let's say someone's coming into care. And let's say particularly old age care. So there's, eventually the client will pass on. If you can imagine someone who comes in there and they have really good intentions and they're coming with this approach, I think there's a natural progression in some ways to this. So you come in, you care for your client, and you form a great relationship with them. You're there for them, and then they die. And this is a natural part of life, of course, and something that we all have to contend with. But, maybe one time you grieve because of that death, and it takes a really big emotional toll on you, and then second time as well, third time as well, and eventually what ends up happening is people put up a bit of a wall because I don't want to get hurt. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people stop there. And I think there's something past that. And that is accepting that, yes, this person will die, and accepting that I will have to grieve as a consequence of that. And there's a detachment in not detaching yourself from the person and the care for the person, but detaching the fact that they will die to your happiness as an individual. But there's a transcendence of that in terms of, I am going to still form a relationship with this person, knowing that they are going to die, knowing that I probably will have to go through a small grief phase afterwards. And there's ways that you can manage that as well and get proper support for that, but choosing to do so anyway. And that's, in fact, not an act of weakness. It's an act of strength and an act of courage. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's really insightful and interesting. Because I think that trend you talked about does happen. There is this sort of natural tendency that we all have to become desensitized to things we're exposed to often.
Yeah.
Right? So that's why, for instance, most people, if you asked them, when you're watching a movie and you see somebody get shot and die, do you cry? And well, no. Well, almost nobody would answer yes to that in our current society, because we've seen people get shot so often on TV or in movies, not necessarily in real life,
right? But
we've seen that so many times that we just become desensitized to it. And there's research going back into the 60s about desensitization to televised violence, and kids actually becoming more prone to aggression if they view too much of it, and that's a concern related to the video game industry right now, actually. But that whole desensitization concept, it applies to all kinds of things in our life, because it is a survival type of mechanism. If there is something that is, I don't know, kind of common or normal in your life, you need to learn to not react to that emotionally, to not be hypersensitive to paying attention to it, because if you think of sort of animals in the jungle, or if you think of our primitive versions, we need to be able to pay attention to new things, because new things present threats.
Yeah.
Old common things don't.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So there is this evolutionary kind of reason why we learn to adapt to normal things and be not reactive to them.
Right. And
normal, I should have said common. And so, the idea of working in long-term care, working in ICU in the hospital, in a lot of settings where death, or in palliative care where death is the job. Death is that sort of daily or weekly experience in your work. I think there is a natural tendency to kind of adapt by not engaging very deeply in the relationship, because the person is going. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting. But I love your point about there being another level beyond that potentially. And I think that we would find that there are lots of people out there who have gone there, who are able to still authentically connect with the patients, with the residents of the long-term care facility, authentically connect, because it is what's best for that client, that resident, and with the knowledge that yes, they're going to pass on. But I think that sort of evolving, if I can use that term, but evolving to what you described, to that place where you're still willing to authentically connect, and then be able to accept the reality of the death, without it being as traumatic perhaps as as earlier in your career. Yeah, I think that that it requires that people first reach an acceptance of death as a concept that is not necessarily a negative thing. Right. If you don't have that, then emotionally you're always going to struggle.
Yeah, if you still have bad next to death, then it will always be bad.
Exactly.
As opposed to an indifferent.
Yeah. And I think that's why it took so long it actually took decades in Canada for us to get to the point of medical assistance in dying legislation, because there's so many people who still saw and still see death as inherently bad.
Right.
But if you come at that from a client perspective or a person perspective, instead of from our own biases, well, I can tell you my own, I've got my grandmother, both of my parents, both of my wife's parents, all had dementia, had or have dementia. So every single bit of my genetic inheritance has that written all over it.
Yeah.
And so at some point I may get that diagnosis. I'm not going to live through that. I don't want to. So from a client perspective, I should have the right to make that decision. And it's not a bad thing. And it's just, individuals should have that right. So if we get to that point where we recognize that it's your life, you have the right to control how it plays out. And it's not like death is an abnormality. It's inevitable.
Right.
It's just you get to choose your timing of it. And but if we don't come at it from that individual perspective, that death actually can be a positive thing. Yeah. And for many people living with chronic types of illnesses that are really horrendous for them, many of whom are in long-term care facilities or in hospitals for lengthy periods of time, is death a bad thing?
Yeah, exactly.
If we make some kind of assumption that it is, I think we're failing to come at it from an individualized client kind of perspective.
Yeah, I feel like too we just don't look at it anymore. Like we don't look at death at all anymore, and it's sort of weird because so in Stoicism, of course, you think about death quite a bit. It's a practice that you do, memento mori, as a way to prioritize your life, as a way to say, okay, well, I am going to die someday. I am mortal, and so what am I going to do today to live the best life and so on, and also to feel grateful in the moment. But it feels like sometimes I mention that to people, and it's sort of a weird thing to say, right? Like, oh, yeah, I think about death sometimes, but but at the same time, I feel like we don't even want to look at it at all, and you see the manifestations of that in hospitals sometimes. People who have a dying relative and do not want to go see the dying relative, or maybe it's a funeral and they don't want to go. And like, I understand that there's those things are very hard, but again, I think it ultimately stems from this place of, is death bad? Is death always bad? Mm-hmm. And I think it is a misunderstanding.
Yeah, I mean, if we come at it from our own perspective, then the death of someone we care about is bad. Mm-hmm. If we come at it from our own perspective, no question, I'm going to miss that person. I don't know how I'll manage whatever, emotionally, physically, I don't know, in whatever ways, without that person. So that's all about me. Yeah. And that's fine, but acknowledging that is important.
Yeah.
That's where that's coming from.
Right.
And that's a very different perspective than what is best for the person who's suffering.
Yeah.
What is best for the person who's ill, who's in pain, who's trapped in their own head because of, dementia, who's what's best for them? Well, the answer might be very, very different. And in many cases, I think the answer is really clear that death doesn't come with that negativity. It's actually peace.
Yeah.
But it does come back to this issue of whose perspective are we taking?
Yeah.
And are we prioritizing?
Yeah. Socrates, I don't know if you know the story of Socrates, but he had a famous death story where he was to be put to death by the state for encouraging people to think, basically. Talking with youth and youth corruption. You're corrupting them by wanting them to think, right? And so anyways, he was to be executed by the state, and he actually...
Was that Socrates or Trump?
Trump may be a modern manifestation of it. I don't know,
because I think that he did the same thing, but it was
yeah, that's funny. So Socrates, he actually had a chance to escape. He could have escaped, he chose not to, because he was at an age where he realized he wasn't going to have that many more good years left. Athens was his home, and he didn't want to leave his home. He didn't want to leave his friends, and so he actually stayed to die, and spent his last day philosophizing with his friends, sitting on a couch dying, spreading his wisdom, kind of thing. And that's to me, that's very noble. It's not quite, like if you're sick, obviously it's very similar. You're having a lot of pain. You're recognizing that, at this point in time, maybe death is not so bad. Like maybe this is actually, it's not always like, what am I going to do? Go in exile and lose all my friends and basically not live? Or am I going to accept death as it is right now and take it and move on, basically?
Yeah. And that's, again, that requires this acceptance that death is inevitable to begin with.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess to some extent, a bit of selflessness in that case of just saying, well, there's no reason to be kind of, fighting this extensively. It's let's just accept reality. That's it. This is my reality right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how in terms of that relationship, I'm interested to know how that would mirror to one's relationship with oneself. So in many ways, I feel like you have to actually care about yourself. I mean, you have to care about yourself in life, because if you care about yourself, you want the best for yourself, and you want yourself to develop into a better person. And this is very hard to do for many people, but I think that you can actually, over time, reach a point where you can see yourself a bit more objectively and love yourself and give yourself what you need and not necessarily what you want. And here's a great example. So if you love yourself, you may do things like, for example, journal, or for example, talk to your wife about your issues. And so this is something that can be difficult to do. You might not quote want it, but you, at that particular time, because it's a difficult thing to do, but because you care about yourself and you love yourself, you are requiring that of yourself, because you want the best for yourself. You want yourself to become better. And so I'm just, obviously there's a detachment in that. It's almost like you take the therapist and the client thing and you put it in your head, and you are both at the same time. Sometimes you're the client who needs to really, I suppose, in many ways, get those issues out. But in some ways, you have to be the therapist to yourself as well, and do what's best for yourself, as opposed to what you want. I don't know. Have you thought about this? This is an interesting idea to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you're talking about would be referred to in psychology as metacognition, and it's thinking about your thinking. And that requires a bit of a sophistication of intellect to be able to do that.
Right.
A sophistication of insight and practice with introspection. It's complicated in some ways, but yeah, I think that many people actually do. I think many people do have those little kind of battles in their head, and the switching back and forth between being as you said, they're being the therapist for themselves versus being themselves as the more vulnerable person who's struggling.
Right.
And I think we see examples of that probably when people try to force themselves to make healthier choices in their life.
Yeah.
So you've been, I've got way too much weight on me, and more than I've ever had in my life. And, I've got a majority of my life as a physically active person, running. I have a black belt at Taekwondo. I mean, I've done some stuff. I did a triathlon once. I mean, and so, but for a number of reasons, I've put on a lot of weight. I don't exercise, and so I'm struggling with that. And one of these days, the therapist is going to win by making me get on my stationary bike, which is what's good for my arthritic leg.
Right.
And so at some point, that in that sort of ongoing conversation, where one voice is saying to me, you've got to actually pull the trigger on this. and not just be thinking about it. You've got to actually make the change. And so I think those internal conversations are very real and very common. And it's kind of interesting the way you've put that in terms of being kind of your own therapist and client inside your head.
Well, I like that you said, so, you've acknowledged that eventually the therapist is going to win out on this particular thing, but that right now, it's so interesting because I've had that realization in some ways recently with work, because in some ways I've prioritized a lot of the things I'm doing at work and my career, and even like with this podcast, I've prioritized that at the expense of some other parts of my life. And the therapist in me knows that that's not good in the long term, and that there's a time limit on that. But the selfish part of me is saying, okay, well, I have an opportunity now, and I feel like I need to utilize that opportunity. And so even though it's interesting you said that, because it just mirrored that for me, because I recognize eventually the therapist in me is going to win out and be like, no, you need to balance out your life a bit more. But right now I'm letting that selfish part of me take over because I feel like that is more important. And that is it's hard to balance those though. And it's a hard, because if someone looks externally at you, they may say, oh, your life is out of balance. Mm-hmm. And the therapist in me would say, yes, I know. The client part of me would say, yeah, I know, but I need it right now.
Yeah.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's, and the distinction you just made is the distinction between, my perspective on you, with all of my biases in interpreting you and your life, versus me trying to understand you from your perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
And, again, that comes back to this concept of client-centeredness in our mental health and addiction systems. And, the job is to actually see the world through the client's eyes, through the other person's eyes, not through ours.
Right.
So if I look at you and think your life is out of balance, well, I'm out of line thinking that way, because that's based on my interpretation of what right is, what balance is, what healthy is. That's my interpretation. Yeah. We've got to look at our society and the way it handles issues of just the weight issue, for instance. So if we look at body image, particularly in our female population, we've got a very long history of objectifying women in a number of different ways. But our society has always had, in marketing, in magazines, in movies, it has always had, an ideal body image for women.
Right.
And it has changed a number of times over the decades.
Through our history, for sure.
Yeah, in terms of, heavier being idealized, to points in the 60s and 70s where as skinny as this is the idealized. And,
right.
But the bottom line is that it's all the rest of us who are doing that to that population.
Yeah.
And creating this idealized image, and sadly, all it has done, instead of recognizing that individuals can actually be healthy and have very, very different types of bodies.
Oh yeah.
People can have different, physiological and life circumstances that create whatever their body type is. Mm-hmm. There's all of this stuff we don't take into account, but most importantly, we think we have the right to impose our biases, our impressions, our desires, our whatever. We think we have the right to impose those on people. And that has led us to really some pretty significant body shaming of people, and the professionals in the eating disorder community would absolutely say that this trend in our society to idealize one type of body is directly responsible, at least in part, for many eating disorders.
Yeah. And
social media has not helped, because people only show their best on social media. So, but again, it all comes back to the fact that people spend too much time judging, interpreting, and perceiving others from our own perspectives instead of trying harder to see the world from the other person's perspective, and accept that is reality, and it's no better or worse than my perception.
Yeah.
I have no, I or you or anybody else has no right to claim that our opinion about so many of these issues is not relevant.
Yeah.
If it's about somebody else.
Yeah.
It
is amazing that, we talk about finding people where they are versus where you think they are. To do that, you have to really listen to them. And it's amazing that all you have to do to help people sometimes is just listen. Mm-hmm. And listening doesn't mean not talking.
Right.
It means really listening. And so I've been thinking about this a bit lately because it's hard. Listening is really hard. And first of all, why do you think that is? Because I've always thought that maybe it's because there is a bit of a selfish endeavor in communicating with people because it is therapeutic. When you are talking with someone, it's natural for us to bring the conversation back to the things that I'm dealing with because that helps me, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to be completely selfless in this particular instance so that I can care for and help the other person. Is that what you think that is? Why is it so? You mentioned some people, when you talk, you say, okay, I have this issue at home, and then the other person says, oh, well, I had this issue a few years ago, and then they blabber on about their own problem. Why is that such a natural tendency, do you think?
Good question. I think, first of all, we see that to different degrees in people, right? So some people don't do that very much. Some people actually do listen for the sake of listening. But many people, and you'll see this sometimes in memes online or whatever, it's become more of a cliche now that, I'm basically, while I'm listening to you, I'm not going to be thinking about what I'm going to say next.
Right.
That concept has become a cliche meme out there.
Yeah.
But I think if we don't pay attention to that, it can get out of control, because there is a pressure in conversations. There's an inherent expectation that it goes both ways, that we go back and forth. So there's some level of need for us to be prepared to have an answer or a next part of the conversation. Yeah. And I think some of that comes from a discomfort with silence. Silence doesn't feel like conversation. And in fact, it can be a completely appropriate part of conversation. I've been teaching at St. Mary's University for 32 or 33 years now, in undergrads in psychology, and I talk to them a lot in a couple of courses. I end up talking about communication, and I end up sort of mentoring some of the students who attach around career issues, and I talk about things like vocal fillers, using the word like and and we'll see people even in prominent positions who just do that extensively. They'll use some type of filler. Those fillers exist to compensate for our discomfort with silence. So, when I'm here talking to you, and I'm guilty of it sometimes too, but I work hard to not do that.
Right.
And I work hard to simply accept that sometimes silence actually just makes sense and there's nothing wrong with it. So when I'm trying to think of what I'm going to say next, I could do that in between things, or I could just take a second, allow for just that little bit of silence, instead of
do you think
filling it.
Do you think people do that because they feel maybe they're a little bit insecure in what they have to say, so they feel like they're going to get interrupted if they don't fill in that silence?
It's very possible, because in our conversations, one of probably the number one cue that it's now my turn is your silence.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
How do you know when to? Because otherwise, it's interrupting.
Right.
If there's still sound coming out of your mouth and I start to speak, then I have interrupted you.
Right.
So I'm listening for silence, but I'm listening for silence that sounds like you're finished. And so I think we have this tendency to need to be prepared because we don't want to be responsible for silence. Yeah. And so that's why some people, but I've also known people, I know one guy who is actually more guilty of this thing we're talking about than anyone I've ever known. And in any conversation, I mean every conversation, no matter what I or somebody else might say, whatever little story we might tell about something in life, something going on, something that happened today, no matter what it is, the next words out of this person's mouth will absolutely be some connection to what was just said, but a story or an opinion or something completely from that person's life. It gets turned completely. I could say, I don't know, I had COVID and nearly died, and this person would come back with, oh geez, yeah, I had a cold last week, and yeah. Oh my God, and I felt this and I felt this, but I used some echinacea and it blah blah blah. That's the nature of conversation,
right?
And it's, I think in those kinds of cases, it's I don't know. I think there's an insecurity or a something that is more about meeting somebody's own attention needs. And so turning it around constantly like that, I think is more about meeting that individual's need for attention. And so having stories, having things to say that make it about them helps to meet those needs. Yeah.
That's interesting. I have a friend who's notorious for long, awkward silences on the phone. And I've gotten used to it. So now it's just when there's silence, it's still a little awkward to me because it's really built into our culture. He's from somewhere else, so for him it's like part of his culture. Like silence is okay, but for here we still have that. That we want to kill the silence. We want to fill the gap. Like no space can be left unspoken.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It somehow implies something to us. I don't know, something about us not being able to generate anything useful or interesting at the time. And
I think some of it can be useful. Like, okay, so for example, if you come at me with a deep story and I need a second to think, there's a small cue there where if I go like and then I think, like there's obviously, I think 95% of the time people say like and is just trash, but I think there is a purpose there in some regards if it's done appropriately. But especially if you don't know the person, like if you know the person really well and they take a second and think, that they're just thinking. But if you have no idea who this person is and you tell them something, there is a cue there where it can be or even let me think about this.
And those are not fillers,
right?
Those are intentional cues that
right.
I'm going to think before I talk.
Yeah, that's true.
A filler is really more literally filling all of that space.
Yeah.
It's a different function.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's a good point.
Yeah, and if you think in a therapeutic context, going back to the kind of the theme here, there is a need for us to have the ability to allow silence in therapeutic contexts, because the clients need to be able to think and feel during the conversation and not just have this constant back and forth. So, good therapy, if it's truly client-centered, allows for some of that.
So how do you communicate that? Okay, so let's say you're a therapist and you know that the person maybe needs a bit of silence, because you need to communicate in some way that you are present and that you care, while also, like you said, allowing the silence to occur. So how do you communicate? Is it body language?
Yeah, I think it can be a variety of things, but when a client is, talking their way through some complicated issues, whether it's stories or feelings, I think that a therapist can just maintain eye contact, maintain sort of the body language that shows I'm in your conversation with you. And that's sufficient sometimes so that the person knows that the floor is still theirs and there isn't any rush.
Yeah, that's good. Eye contact is huge.
It is, yeah. And so you're not disconnecting from the conversation. You're not sitting there, I don't know, writing notes and looking around and as if there's really nothing to say. You're staying engaged, looking at the person with interest in whatever is going to come next.
Right.
You can tell when, in any conversation, you can tell when somebody's actually interested in what you're going to say next.
Yeah, and that's weird. How do you tell? Because I know exactly what you mean. When you're talking with someone or they're listening and they're not paying attention, but what tells you that? Is it like a very minor cue in the eyebrows or something?
I think we have hundreds of muscles in our face. Right?
Yeah.
I forget how many, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, but it allows us over time to detect incredibly subtle positioning of the various pieces of our face and expressions that I don't know, we just learn to interpret. Yeah. And as we get to know individuals better, we get to know their faces better. And so I think we just get better at interpreting those tiny little cues, because you can have a conversation with somebody who is making eye contact with you, but you can tell they're glazed over, like they're somewhere else.
Oh yeah.
Like they don't give a shit about what you're saying at this moment.
I had a friend, sorry to interrupt, I had a friend, because I got to tell the story. I had a friend who in university, he had a floating eye, but it would only float when he wasn't paying attention to the conversation. So like you would know, right? And he knew, he knew about it and everything, but you'd be talking with him and then you'd see the eye start to float and it's like, come on, man, I know you're not paying attention. Like, let's get back to the conversation.
So he had a tell.
He had a big tell, but yeah, it's like you said, there are these little cues that we pick up on. And
so now imagine in a therapeutic context. Imagine a client being the client and having a therapist who, let's say, is not genuinely client-centered.
You can tell.
Like inside them. Like they're not there. They're in it because, well, this is a job they thought they'd like, or, they're 20 years into their career now and they, I don't know, have lost some of that genuine interest in what the client is going through. And they don't experience as much empathy, real empathy, and what is the client seeing and feeling?
Yeah.
From a truly client-centered perspective, we got to say, this client is going to be feeling like, well, so I let me give you sort of a personal connection. I've lived with depression most of my life. And so one of the things that I often say is that people who have mental illness have a superpower, and that superpower is we're able to detect a lack of genuineness, a lack of compassion, judgment, stigma. We're able to detect those things better than anybody because we're paranoid about them.
Right.
So if I think that I'm not worth anything, which is often part of depression, I'm watching for other people to give me signs that that's true.
Yeah.
And so I can detect those tiny little muscle changes in your face better than you can in other people. There is a sensitivity, a hypersensitivity to it. If I've got an anxiety problem, an anxiety disorder, same thing. I am constantly worried about stuff. So I'm looking for cues that are like threats, essentially, to my psychological safety, we'll say.
Do you think sometimes that can actually be a negative, though? Maybe if you can see things that aren't there, you create this deception around it.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely. Yeah. It's, superpowers are not all good things. If you look at all the superheroes, there are some of them who've caused more destruction than good.
The Hulk. I watched Avengers last night, so I know all about that.
Absolutely right. And so, it's it absolutely is a bad thing, but in most of the time it's a bad thing because it does create in many of us this, because we become so hypersensitive that we interpret things that aren't there.
Right.
We interpret judgment and stigma and being looked down on, or being not really understood or tolerated. We interpret that in other people, even if they're not actually feeling it, but we see it. We see it, and that can be really problematic. And so if you take that into in my book about changing our mental health system, not so much the care, the one-to-one, but the system, all the steps people have to go through, making that client-centered. I talk about things like the people who are in the roles of, say, receptionist, so the one who's answering the phone, the one who's greeting people at the desk when they first walk into the waiting room, to register for their appointment, or those people. We don't think of them, when we think of client-centeredness, we don't think of them as relevant to the conversation. Because it's an administrative type of function.
Yeah.
It's just the person answering the phone who's going to type your information into a database to book an appointment, or to whatever, to ask you 20 questions about the nature of your issue so that they can, book it for you. And the greeting is the same thing when you show up. But yet those people are the ones, I would argue, are the most important in terms of determining whether I am going to feel safe enough to actually show up for my appointment.
Yeah, it's the first impression.
It's I use this phrase, and I didn't create it. I wish I did, but the people who are the receptionists in these kinds of things they're the directors of first impressions.
Yeah,
and so I had in my staff group at one point, I've had various people who were in that role, that frontline, first answering the phone kind of role. And there was one young woman who, she just had the most genuinely loving personality of anybody I had ever met. And she genuinely loved making clients feel good. So somebody would call, and they would, at the end of it, they would feel like they just had a conversation with everybody's favorite grandmother. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of feeling of warmth and welcome and importance and value. And she was just brilliant at it. So people wanted to come. They wanted to be there. They liked showing up because they would have a couple of minutes of conversation at the reception desk or in the waiting room that would warm them.
Yeah.
And these are people who, as I said, have a superpower. And so the tiniest little bit of anything other than that, and they're going to feel bad about themselves.
Right.
They couldn't feel bad about themselves with this person. And I can think of another person who was in a similar role and during a period of time, who was more like, I don't know, the Hulk. like there was just this coldness.
Yeah.
The personality was just more cold. The tone of voice. So I ask this question often when I do trainings and talks places. Can you tell when you're on the phone, if you call some company or organization, can you tell if the person on the other end is smiling? Can you tell if they're happy to be talking to you, or if they're just going through the motions of doing their job?
Right.
Can you sense the difference, and in terms of their genuine interest in helping you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. When I ask that in an audience of 500 people, every hand goes up to say, yes, you can. You don't have to see all the muscles in their face. There's something about the tone of voice, the type of words, and it all comes from, some of it might be related to the shape of their mouth while they're talking, and creating different tones. I don't know that stuff.
Different volume.
I just know that we know.
Yeah.
And so even on the phone, this other person was just, you could tell this, she didn't actually care about you.
Yeah.
Like in any way. And so that difference right there is the difference between, a system-centric versus a client-centric type of system, because it's not the care. Mm-hmm. Neither one of them are care providers.
Yeah, it's a system. Yeah.
That's part of the system. It's the administrative component that clients need to go through in order to get to the care.
Yeah,
to get in and out of the care, to move between aspects of care. It's those in-betweens that are administrative pieces. They're the system pieces. And we take them for granted. So, and we don't do anything about it because it's complicated, because, it's in many cases, it's a unionized environment. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you really can't hire for personality. How do you get a union to agree that you're going to hire for warmth?
Yeah, right.
And compassion, and genuineness and empathy. How do you measure that in an interview so that because if it's a unionized environment, you got a collective agreement that pretty much says anybody that's got the very basics of the skills needed, seniority wins.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes the person that's survived there the longest is the one that's more like a cockroach.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not anti-union. It's not that. I'm just saying these are aspects of the system that we don't think about, and we don't. I don't know. We often, I think, people in management and leadership roles in these systems, they aren't willing to take on those issues because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard conversations and hard fights with whatever senior leaders or unions or whoever, to make those kinds of changes. But they are critical to the client experience, to that person's experience.
Oh, those people, a good person at the drive-thru in Tim Hortons makes you go back to that Tim Hortons.
There you go.
Right, that's exactly it.
There you go. And it's not because they get your order right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Because
there's a warmth and a genuineness there that you can sense and you can feel, and for sure.
And we all learn to fake that. We think we do.
We think we know, but you can tell.
You can tell. You walk in. I mean, many of us worked in retail at some point in our very early careers, right? Our early work world, as teenagers or in college or whatever. And we learned to create this our retail face, which is that sort of fake smile and the fake tone, and you're hungover on a Saturday morning, and the first customer comes in, and you've got to pretend to be happy about that by saying, "Hi, how you doing today?" And you got this phoniness about your face, and so we learned that stuff. But again, people know the difference.
People can tell, absolutely.
People know the difference. So it's. The bottom line of that is that, when trying to serve other people in any capacity, whether it's therapeutically or at the drive-thru, you can't really fake authenticity.
Exactly.
Like that is the ultimate oxymoron.
Yeah.
You can't fake genuineness.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think just getting near the end here, that's a great spot to end, but I do want to ask you one last question here, mini question. So I have a lot of theories on the meaning of life and so on, but
that's shocking.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But I like to ask people, what is your specific meaning in life? What gives your life meaning?
For me, and I really hesitate to say it because I don't. It isn't for me a narcissism thing. It isn't. I just don't want it to be heard that way. But my own personal kind of mission, reason, kind of in life is, I think, my sense that I have a responsibility to do what I can to make other people's lives better, but particularly for the next generation. That's where my focus is. My focus tends to always be on future. And so that's why I'm so heavily into changing systems. So you can change the care provided to one person, that's fine. But if you change the way the system works, the way government policy works, the way administrative processes work in any type of, human service, then you change the experience of everyone that comes after.
Yeah.
And so that's where my focus has always been. I've always been an advocate for policy change on all kinds of, social justice and health kinds of issues. And, I remember being part of a group of 22 people who were ultimately responsible for the provincial legislation on no smoking in indoor public places. And I think about things like that, and I think like that and again, I was one of many. It wasn't me, but I was one of many who were the core advocate group that brought that. And I get to think, I made a contribution. I made my little bit, and that's the part that for me is satisfying, and that's what I think it's about, in terms of my meaning of life and purpose. I think we all have a responsibility to do what we can to make life better for the next generation. That's why I applaud people who are, the climate change advocates and all the future oriented system and culture change people, the people who are fighting hard to change us to to being more of an anti-racist culture, and all of that kind of stuff that's what I think it's really about. It's how do we make it better for the next people, my kids, my grandchildren, their great grandchildren.
Right. Wonderful. Great spot to end. Thank you so much. Listen, I really enjoyed the conversation. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Anybody interested in more?
Yes. No. Yeah. Definitely mention your book there.
Yeah. So there's the title of it.
Yep.
If you're interested in more about system change to become more client-centered.
Yep. I'll link all that in the show notes and everything. And I'll do an introduction as well before the episode. So thanks again, Todd. Listen, that was fun. We'll do it again sometime. And until next time.
Thanks, man.
Bye, everyone.